Okay, so in this video we're going to use our ISession to build some extended functionality to include JSON as well as strings and integers. So essentially we're going to use newtonsoft.json to convert our team's objects to a string. That way we can save that string down to our session, or save that string to our session. So what I'm going to need to do is build some extension methods to allow for our session to account for JSON as well. So what an extension method is we're going to, since we can't actually change the functionality of the ISession object, what we're going to do is build some extended functionality on that ISession object. And we can do that using extension methods. So let's go ahead and go to our models folder and add in a new file. And we're going to call that file session extensions. So it's commonplace to always name your extensions whatever you're extending, so in this case session, and use the extensions after that to show whoever is reading your code or your files that this file contains extension methods, which we'll explain a little bit better when we code through it here. So let's code first our namespace, which will then be NFL teams.models. And since our class is named session extension, let's go ahead and do public class session extensions. Okay. So since these are essentially utility functions that we're going to use to extend this session class, what we want to do is actually make this class static. So we're never going to create an object using this, so let's just go ahead and make the class static. That way we can never make instances of it. So what we want now is the ability to set and get JSON using our session. So we're going to want one method to set our JSON objects and one method to get those JSON objects back from our session using string types. So I'm going to need a set method and a get method. So let's first code the set. So we know we want this to be public. Our method is static, so we're going to need to set our class is static, so we're also going to need to set our method as such. Since it's a set, we're not going to return anything. And we can say set object. And we want to be able to pass in any type of object. So we want this to be generic. So whether it be XML or JSON, we're going to pass in JSON. But let's go ahead and put a T here to tell it that this is going to be generic. Okay. And then from there, now we get into the specifics of how we're going to tell it that this is an extension method. So the first thing that we do with an extension method is we tell it exactly what we're extending, and we do that using the this keyword. And we're extending ISession, which we're calling here session. And then we'll need to use the using statement for the ISession. And then what else are we going to take in to this method other than what we're extending? Well, we want the key. How are we going to refer to this object within the session? And the value, which we already know is generic. Okay, so now we have a method to set our object, which is generic. It extends session. So it's going to extend the functionality within session, which we'll see exactly what that does on the other end here in a second. And now we want to make a get method, so we're going to make it public, so that way we can access it from outside of our class. We're going to make it static, since that's what our class is. We want to be able to that the access is still the same. It's going to return generic, so it's going to return back T, going to be called get object because we really don't know what we're getting out of this session until we return it. And now we need to, again, return back ISession, or type in an ISession because we're extending our session object. And since we're getting our object, we really don't know what the object is because you can see we put in a generic object, so we're going to return a generic object. All we need to take in now is the key. So we're going to return back whatever key was given to us, the object that's attached to that key within the session. So you can see that we have our code is currently broken because we're not returning anything. So we're going to say var value, so the value of whatever is in the session equals session dot get string, because it's going to, our JSON object will be kept in here as a string. So we're going to get in the string back from our object, and then since we know we're saving it as JSON, let's go ahead and return, and we're going to convert that using our JSON deserializer. So it is JSON, and we want to deserialize that back into a list of teams. So let's go ahead and say, as long as the string is not null or empty. So if the string is null or empty, we don't want to return back null. So we just want to return back the default of whatever the object is. And we'll get into that in a second. So first we check if the string is null or empty. So if the string is null or empty, we're going to go and return default of our generic object here. So it could be null if it's a reference type. So it could return null if it's a reference type. Otherwise, we want to return back, since we know that we're going to keep JSON in here. We're going to return back if it's not null, JSON convert, and we'll probably need to using newtonsoft.json. And within JSON.convert, we can deserialize our object, which we already said was of type T, so it's generic, and we want to pass it the value. So let's go ahead and put these on a couple different lines and talk about exactly what this is doing. So first we're getting the value from our session, so get the value with our string key. So let's say the key is my teams. I want to get my teams back from my session, so now I have the JSON here within the value. So first, let's make sure that that is not null or empty to make sure that it's not null. If it is, go ahead and return null. Otherwise, if it's not, if that is valid JSON, go ahead and convert that, deserialize the JSON into the object that it is, which it'll know based on the type that or how the JSON is formatted, and we're going to pass in the value. So it'll return that then as our team. Okay, so I can save this. Next, we need to finish our set method, which will be a simple one-line session.set object, or set string, I'm sorry, since we're converting it to a string. We got passed in the key, so as you can see, whenever I put in parentheses here, it takes in the key and the string values. So they passed me the key. Next, we need to turn in the value, which is our team object, into, or it could be our list of teams, into JSON. So we need to switch it from JSON into a string. So let's go ahead and again do JSON convert But instead of serialize, we need to do the deserialize. We need to do the opposite and serialize. And value. So if they passed me something that's an object, I'm going to serialize that object into JSON. And then since it's now a string, so JSON serialize, you can see returns the string. So it's now no longer an object, it's a string. And we're going to save that string into our session. Conversely, whenever we get the object using our session, we're going to pass in the key of the object we want to get. And then if it's not null, we want to deserialize that JSON. So you see our value is a string. And we want to deserialize that back into an object or a type T. So now we should be able to go back to our NFL session and set our session to use that now. So now I should be able to say session.setObject. And you can see it takes in a string key and T value. So the key I'm going to use is my team's key. From the top here, my teams, and I'm going to pass it my team's object. So without, you can see this is an extension method that I just built, so it finds it. And you can see it takes in a type of ISession, so it extends ISession, set object. So without doing that extension method back here, this method call wouldn't be possible. Because I didn't build this ISession object, Microsoft did. So I'm extending Microsoft's functionality to include setting in objects using our JSON deserializer. So next, let's go ahead and set in how many teams we have favorited. So we're going to go ahead and use the setInt32 method. I'm going to set the count key. I'm going to set that as teams.count. And that's all the setMyTeams method will do. So now to get my teams back out of the session, I'm going to return back a list of team, since that's what the JSON will deserialize it as. Let's go ahead and call it getMyTeams. And it's going to be one line of code that's going to get that from the session. So session.getObject. It's going to be of type list team. And it's going to take in that team key. Now this could return null, so if it does return null, let's go ahead and tell it to instead return an empty list of team. Okay. Let's also code a way to get the count of how many teams we have favorited, so we can public int get team count. And let's return back session.getInt32 count key. So we'll pass it the count key, which is teams count. Otherwise, if that doesn't return anything, we're going to return 0. So if this is null for whatever reason, we'll return 0. Okay, so lastly, we'll need to have a couple methods to set and get the conference. So let's go ahead and say public void set active conference. Now let's take in the string active conference. And that'll simply be one line of code, session.set string. the key, which is our conference key, and the string of the conference, which is our active conference. Let's go ahead and do a getter for that. String get active conference. Which will be a simple get from our session. So we can do session.getString. And we can pass back the key, which is conference key. And then let's do the same thing for division. So let's go ahead and say public void set active division. We're going to take in the division. And that'll say session.setString using our division key and our division value of active division. Let's create a getter for our active division. It's going to return a string, get active division, and it'll simply get it from the session. Session.getString with our division key. And since this isn't a primitive type, since this is a string, we can simply return this, because if it doesn't find it, it'll just return null. Lastly, we'll have a method to remove all of those from our session. So let's go ahead and have a method called remove my teams. So maybe I want the website to forget my favorite teams. I can say session.remove the teams key and session.remove our count. Okay, so as a review, we have extended our session to include setting an object. So we're going to pass on our list of teams, which is generic here. So it doesn't have to be a list of teams, just in this case it's going to be. But since we coded it to be generic, it can take in any type of object. We're just casting it to a list of team here using this cast here. So it's essentially saying get object, and it's telling it what object it should be. And if it's not, if it doesn't deserialize into that, it'll just return back this. So this is telling it what it should expect. If it finds something and deserializes it not into this for whatever reason, it'll just return back a blank list of teams. So it'll essentially keep our web app from failing. So we set our object using JSON, and then we're going to get then our object back out of the session using these extension methods. So we can set all of our favorite teams and get all of our favorite teams. So what we'll need to do now is in our controller, whenever we add our team to the list, let's go to our home controller, we'll need to set it then in the session. So the first thing we'll need to do is create that NFL session. So var session equals new NFL session. And you can see it takes in now this ISession object. So what we'll need to do is pass in that from our context. So we can say HTTP context. Here's our context object that holds our session, dot session. So now it knows which session we're working with depending on the user that's logged in. Then we can get their favorite teams. So var teams equals session.get my teams. What does it not like about get my teams? Session.getMyTeams cannot be used like a method. Let's go back here. Did I do something wrong here? Set my teams. Oh, okay, I didn't put parentheses around it. All right, should be an easy enough fix. So now we can call it like a method. All right. So now that I have my favorite teams, so if it's null, so as you can see from my NFL session, if there currently is not any favorite teams, it's just going to return back a new list of team. So since I do have an empty list, I can go ahead and add to that list. So I can say teams.add. I'm going to add the teams that I got back from my database here. Okay, so since I added it to their favorite teams, I'm then going to set their favorite teams back into the session. So session.set my teams, and I'm going to send it then the new list of teams after I added their new favorite team to it. And then we'll go ahead and put on the layout a message that tells them that their ad was successful. I'm going to put that in temp data, since once it's read, it'll go away. Let's go ahead and call it message. Let's format data.team.name added to your favorites. Okay, so now we should have a session. We should put those teams in the session. Now I still need to go ahead and get the conference that they were looking at here. Get active conference, as well as session.get active division. Okay, so now that we're using session, we'll actually need to change some of our code to use the session instead of using this temp data. So we're using temp data to keep track of which active conference and division they're looking at. And instead of using temp data to do that, since we're currently holding it in session, let's go ahead and alter our code to look at that session now. So we'll have to say, we'll have to use our session here, equals new NFL session. Go ahead and get it from that HTTP context again. And then from there we can say session dot set active conference as the active conference, and then session dot set active division to the active division. Okay, so now that it will set the active conference and division in our session, we also need to do that in our details view as well. So if we remember, the whole reason we had this details method was essentially just to hold this active conference in our session, or in our state, to keep the state of the active conference and division. But since we have that currently done in our session, we really don't need this method anymore. So let's go ahead and remove this. Let's remove the post. like I said, I might not need this at all. Let's go ahead and get rid of this method, or just comment it out for now. Let's do a Control K, C. All right. And now whenever we go to the details page, let's go ahead and get the conference from the session. A new NFL session using the HTTP context. And then instead of getting it from the temp data, we can then get it from the session. So session.getActiveDivision. And session.getActiveConference. Okay. So as you can see, we're already getting more lean just by using our session object.